right, so last week we began this conversation about rhythms of life in the beginning, in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. And we talked about the good news for all of us that God's first command, his desire for people, was for them to be productive. He said to be fruitful and to increase in number, or to grow. And we saw that both work and rest were part of God's design for creation. He, in fact, did both of those things by creating the universe out of nothing. The Bible begins, in the beginning, God. So there was nothing except for God, and he was completely sufficient in and of himself, but he decided to work. He decided to create. And the world and animals and humans were the outcome of his creation. But he also, even though he was completely sufficient in and of himself, God doesn't run out of energy. He doesn't get tired. He decided to rest, to just take in and to enjoy everything that he had created. And this pattern of work and rest, rest and work, is a pattern that he invites humans to participate in as well. But even though God rested after his work, because humans fall in the order of creation at the end, their first full day of life was the Sabbath, was God's day of rest. And so we talked about the idea that human beings are not created to just work, push, and then crash and hope to recover, but that actually we're designed to be intentional about resting and to start from a place of rest so that we can be the most productive, so that we can create the best lives and bear the most fruit that we possibly can. At Sycamore, I introduced this tool last week. We call it the semicircle, and it's derived from the idea, the picture of a pendulum that's swinging back and forth, right? And so this pattern that God establishes is a window into the life that every person is created to live. But as we read in John 15 today, Jesus speaks into this same pattern, but he particularizes it. He's specific about it for his disciples. Now, we've talked before in the past that a good modern day equivalent of the word disciple is apprentice, right? And if you think about an apprentice is not just a laborer, an apprentice is not just a worker bee, right? They start from a position of learning. They just observe the master, and then they participate along with the master. But the idea is that they become like the master craftsman, master builder, master artisan, so that someday they can carry on the business. They can start their own business, and they in turn can turn and teach people how to do the same things that they were taught to do, right? So as Jesus is talking to his disciples in this passage, he's talking to anybody who desires to be one of his disciples, right? So anybody who's learning how to live life like Jesus, who ultimately wants to become like Jesus in their own life, this word is for them. So what I would love for somebody to do is to read John chapter 15, verses 1 to 8 aloud for us so that we can all hear it.
I'm the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does not bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I've spoken to you. Remain in me, and I will remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If a man remains in me and I in him, he will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If anyone does not remain in me, he is like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be given to you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples.
Thank you. So this, when we overlay John 15 on top of Genesis 1 and 2, um, we're given this image of the vine by Jesus, the grapevine by Jesus, and the outcome of um, effective, productive work of a follower of Jesus, he describes as fruitfulness. And the word remain that we heard as Annie read, that's translated in the NIV and other translations. In more literal translations like the ESV or the Revised Standard Version, the word abide is actually used. And so I want to talk about each one of these words a little bit. What I want you to know, though, before we get into that, is that um, just like um, the picture of an apprentice, a disciple of Jesus is actually in the process of transformation, right? A disciple is actually in the process of becoming someone completely new. And what that someone is Jesus, with your personality, with your placement in life, your context in your neighborhood, in your workplace, in your family, whatever else. If you think of, one of some ways that might help us understand this, if you think of a career change, if you think, for example, of a musician, right, who has spent their time learning a particular instrument, gone through a lot of training, done performances, maybe even taught others, all of a sudden they decide in life, okay, I've kind of had it with being a musician. I'm going to become a mechanic now, right? The work that they do, the requirements and responsibilities that are placed on them impacts what it means to be fruitful, right? If you take your vehicle into that mechanic with a problem and they start playing the guitar, it's not super helpful, right? So because of the new person that they've become, uh, being fruitful, doing good work, being productive has changed, right? Um, Probably what is more true, though, about this process of becoming a disciple, because it speaks to our identity at the core of who we really are. It's probably more like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly, right? And so it's not just that the job has changed, that what being productive has changed. I don't know what makes a caterpillar productive. I guess that they kind of slinch around and eat leaves, right? But for a butterfly, right? If a butterfly just kind of crawled around and hit itself and ate leaves, that's not what it's designed for anymore, right? It's designed to fly. It's designed to be beautiful, right? It's designed to bring beauty into the world, to bring joy to people who see it, right? And so its purpose has completely changed because its identity has changed. And Jesus is saying to his disciples, okay, yes, you are created to do good work. You're created to do that from a place of rest. But I'm actually starting to put parameters to help define what's a life worth living. What is a fruitful, meaningful, productive life, right? He says that at the very end of his passage, verse 8. He says that if you bear the kind of fruit that comes from a life connected to me, you will show yourself to be my disciples, to be my apprentices, to be my followers, right? So let's think a little bit about the actual image that Jesus is presenting us with, right? This is the goal. This is the outcome, right? To produce good fruit. Um, and then Jesus talks about what that actually is in this passage. But I think it's helpful for us in the context of this discussion about rhythms, about rest and work, about being fruitful and working to abide in his presence. It's helpful to see how the vine starts, right? Grapevines are planted in the ground and then they're grown on some sort of trellis system. There's all kinds of different ones you can do. This is just one example for you. But a few things that are important and helpful for us in this conversation. The first is that grapevines typically aren't allowed to bear fruit for the first 2 to 3 seasons. And the reason why is because their branches are not strong enough to hold them. And so as the fruit is born on the plant, they're too heavy. And so they'll either break the branch or if they're not fully supported, and the branches will fall onto the ground and they'll rot out. Right. And so they're prevented to bear fruit. In the same way, some of the branches bear fruit and some of the branches don't bear fruit. And so the gardener will prune off the branches that don't bear fruit so that all of the energy that's coming from the vine or the root of the plant goes towards the branches that are fruitful, right? And this is the exact picture that Jesus is giving. He says, I'm the true vine. In other words, I'm the root of the plant. I'm the source of life for the plant. And my Father is the gardener. He takes care of all of the plants in the garden, right? All the branches, all the shoots that come from the vine, that come from me, he's the one who takes care of them. And some of those he prunes back because they're just not fruitful, and they're not worth anything at that time, right? You can't burn a vine branch, right? Like you can a dead twig from an oak tree, for instance, right? That can be good for firewood and produce heat and light and memories and other things around a campfire. Grapevines, they're not worth anything, right? And so they're just thrown out to decompose, right? So he throws some of them out. Other ones he prunes back. Jesus says it right here in the text in verse 2, so that they will be even more fruitful, right? If we go back to our semicircle that's formed from this swing pendulum between abiding and bearing fruit, there's two other things that I'm just going to mention that we'll go into in future weeks in greater detail, but just we don't have the time and for today. And I really want to focus more on the abiding and fruitfulness this morning. But obviously, as a plant, the grapevine is planted in the ground and then starts moving up the trellis system. It's growing. Growth, as it relates to our connection with Jesus, is going to be measured in seasons. It's going to be measured over periods of time. Very rarely can we experience growth in the moment, right? Or that we're really aware of growth in the moment. But growth is something that's measured by looking back, right? This is where I was a month ago, a year ago, 5 years ago, right? And so the idea is we're looking for fruit. We're looking to grow both in the character of Jesus and in the activity of Jesus, right? So are we growing in love? Are we growing in mercy? Are we growing in faithfulness? Are we growing in our ability to forgive, right? But also, are we growing in our boldness to share our faith with people? Are we growing in our capacity to have words for our story, for what he's done in our lives? Do we ever pray for anybody that needs healing, right? Are we sensitive to the needs of the people in our family, sensitive to the needs of people in our workplace or in our neighborhoods? And are we proactive in meeting those needs? Are we owned by our money or our time? Or are we growing to have ownership over our money and over our time, right? These are things that we can measure as we look back and take stock of where our life is now relative to where it was in the past. But just like the text says, there's also periods of pruning. And as we swing back to a place of abiding, and forgive me because I failed to define that term in the last slide. So let me do that right now, because abiding isn't really a word that a lot of us use in our everyday speech. But it's this idea, these are some definitions: to wait for, to accept without objection, or to remain stable or fixed in a state. Like right now, the trees as we look out our windows, the trees that we can see are abiding, right? They're hibernating. They're certainly not dead, but they're remaining stable. They're waiting waiting out the season of coldness so that they can again be fruitful when the spring and the summer comes. Now, pruning can be a painful process, right? Because literally things are being removed, they're being cut off. But again, if we really are believing these words of Jesus, and we're believing that God our Father does those things so that we can actually be more fruitful, so that we can live better, more productive lives. Where I want to end here, and as we move into our group discussion, is getting us really to a clear understanding, if it's not clear already, of this abiding and fruitfulness. We're getting ready to enter the church season of Lent. I have to say that I'm not a person that has religiously observed Lent over the past 15, 20 years. This year, I just have this sense that I'm going to be more intentional about it, though, and I'm going to invite you guys into that. And Lent is a period in which we focus on Jesus, we reflect on our faith, reflect on what he's done for us, and we look forward to his victory, our victory over sin and death on the cross and through the empty tomb of Easter, right? Abiding is all about remaining in God's presence, waiting for him to act and not being so anxious or eager to act on his behalf. It's taking our anxieties, our worries, the questions that we have about our own faith, about our own life, the sadness that we have about the sin in the world, the injustice in the world, the least of the world that are so often forgotten or trampled on by those that the world deems as strong, right? And the picture for me that is most vivid is that moment where Jesus has retreated in the Garden of Gethsemane. It's just moments before he's going to be betrayed by one of his best friends, where he's going to be arrested without any cause, where he's going to be mocked and beaten and abandoned by the Roman Empire, by all of his friends, right? And he's in the garden and he's anxious, right? Because he knows what's been written about him in the scriptures. He knows where he's headed. He knows that worst of all, he's going to be separated from his Father, because that's what sin does, and that's ultimately what hell is eternal separation from God, a complete disconnection of relationship with him. And Jesus knows that because he's going to have to take on the sin of the world, that is going to disconnect him from his Father. That God, who's always existed in perfect community and perfect relationship, is going to be abandoned from one another, right? That they're going to be broken apart. And he's begging God, right? Luke tells in his gospel that he's sweating drops of blood in this moment. And he says, Father, take this cup from me if it's possible, but not my will, have yours be done in my life, right? That's when you know you're really abiding, when you can say those words and actually mean them. Not my will, but yours be done. I think sometimes we confuse abiding with coming to God to ask him for all the things that we want to do, or laying our plans before him and saying, God, will you now bless this and empower me to do what I want to do? But the way of the world is to do what we want to do. The way of the world is to set goals and visions for ourselves, to lift ourselves up, and then to get after those, to accomplish all those things. The way of the kingdom is the way of selflessness. It's the way of laying down our lives, right? When you think about the idea, the picture of the vine, fruit is not for the branch, right? The fruit is for others who will enjoy it, right? And so if we really are disciples, if we really are people that are connected to Jesus, then the fruit of our lives is going to be for the benefit and blessing of others. And on that Last Supper that Jesus had with his disciples, he broke the bread and he said, this is my body that's given for you. And he poured out the wine and he said, this is my blood that's shed for you, right? The fruit of Jesus's life, his broken body and his spilled blood, was the free gift of grace, the gift of eternal life, a relationship with God, a relationship that we did not earn nor do we deserve, but that is just given to us, right? And so this morning, as we enter into a conversation with one another, this Lent, as we fix our eyes on Jesus and start this journey to the cross, I encourage you to be thinking about what the fruit of your life is and how that relates to the degree to which you are intentional about abiding in Christ, about just resting in the presence of God. In your groups, these are the two questions that I encourage you to consider. So the first is all about what is right now. It's an inventory question, right? So how would you describe your connection with Jesus right now? Now, some of you, like myself, are tempted to feel guilty, right? That's how I'm wired. That's where sin tends to take its hold on me, right? And so I'm always looking at where I fall short, right? In my flesh, that's my default, is to look where I fall short. We know that because of Jesus, anyone who has faith in him shares his identity. And the words that we hear from our Father always, apart from our performance, is that we're his children, he loves us, and he's proud of us, right? So this question is not designed to make anyone feel guilty or ashamed. This question is to give us the opportunity to be honest about where we are. So 0, no connection with Jesus, doesn't mean you have to feel bad about that, but it is helpful to be honest about that, right? Make sense? So go ahead and take an inventory. At the very least, I would encourage everyone in your groups to share your numbers, okay? If you want to talk about why you think that is, that's great. I know some folks aren't going to feel comfortable doing that, but at the very least, I think that we have enough trust in one another that we can just share our numbers, okay? And then the second question is this: what needs to happen this Lent season for Jesus to have your full attention? In other words, for you to just focus on the root of your life, rather than the fruit of your life, right? What's it going to take for Jesus to have your full attention? And I wrote a few things that have been helpful for me there in parentheses. You can think about stop, start. So in other words, what do you need to stop doing? Or what do you need to start doing for Jesus to have your full attention? It's always helpful to be specific rather than be general. And team up, right? You have a group now that you've been walking with for the better part of 9 months, right? Lean into them for help, for support, for prayer, for encouragement, for accountability. I love you guys. Have a great time in your breakouts and have a great week ahead.